congratulations. The new album is just about to be released, right?
It is indeed. Yes, it comes out tomorrow, and it's an interesting thing with the release process because, of course, you know, you do these days you do an awful lot of build up in terms of promotion, especially online. So
Yep.
to a degree, it kind of feels like it's out already. It's not quite the same as when it was all physical and there was this big release date, but there's
Right.
going to be a big release on many levels. I think it's going to be a sense of, phew, we finally got there.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and of course, it's your first one since what, 2013. So
That's right. Yeah.
that makes a big deal as well because, and a lot of stuff has happened between now and back then. So I'm sure that yeah, it's good to get it finally out and about. And of course, it's a weird time to release records and music and whatever because of all the stuff going on in the world. So,
isn't it? I mean, it's an interesting one, Marty, because we finished the album end of last year, and we were all set to release. We had a whole mechanism in place, and then the pandemic hit, lockdown happened, and we had to make a decision. Do we go with a single and set the whole thing in motion during lockdown, or is that a stupid idea? And everyone in the business, all the experts were saying, oh no, you know, wait till 2021.
right.
And whether rightly or wrongly, we just said, you know, because of the nature of the album, it's a very optimistic album. It deals with some very socially relevant issues. We thought, actually, this is possibly the right time to do it.
I think you're right.
And we'll know in time. We'll know if that was the right thing or not.
Yeah, I think people could use a bit of optimism at this point, depending on especially where you are in the world. And that leads me to my first question. Is it more difficult to be optimistic when you're writing music than to kind of complain and grouse about stuff?
Well, I think it depends on who you're speaking to. I mean, I have to say, I have to always say complain, because there is an element of that. Actually, I'm drawn towards music that has an innate sorrow to it. So
Right.
that's not necessarily being negative.
Right.
That said, I think on this album, Wide Awake, I made a conscious decision to try and see the positive in the many global situations that we're facing, many global challenges. For example, our current single, New Day Ahead, is about climate change and really the degradation of the environment in general. And I've written songs in the past on that subject. And it's very hard not to be melancholy about what's happening at the very least.
Yeah.
But in this situation, I think we've reached the point where we have to have a can-do attitude about whatever we're facing, because it's so overwhelming, and the challenges we face seem to be increasing, not decreasing. So I think actually it was very healing for myself to write with a positive attitude. More positive than I've ever written before, while still not shying away from the reality of the situations we're facing. So it's a new territory for me, how to be positive, but also how to be honest and realistic.
Right, right. And so I assume that you've played the record for family and friends and acquaintances and other musicians. What has the reaction been so far, and to the first couple of singles that have been out?
The reaction's been great. I mean, one thing that was interesting, making this album, my colleague Mike and myself made a conscious decision to allow some of the influences of the music that we listened to when we were growing up in the 70s to have a subliminal influence. So we knew it was going to be a Johnny Hates Jazz album because when we work together, we just sound the way we do.
Right.
But there was this other dimension to it. And we kept looking at each other in the process thinking, I wonder what people are going to think of this. Are they going to like it or not?
Yeah.
And the irony is that most people have come back and said, oh, classic Johnny Hates Jazz album. Doesn't sound different to them at all. So I think the first two singles, Spirit of Love and New Day Ahead, have really grabbed people. And I think they've got the topical nature of the album and the songs, and this kind of, as I said, very optimistic can-do approach. And I think people are really enjoying that.
Right, right, right. It's interesting because Johnny Hates Jazz is very much associated with the 80s, yet you're kind of thinking about how the 70s is influencing what you're doing now. So do you see that as some kind of yin and yang kind of thing going on, or how do you feel about it?
I guess in a way, yes. And one of the reasons for that is that I think that contemporary music has uh, lost its sense of ancestry.
Hmm.
And one of the reasons for that, I think, is streaming, because everything and anyone is available online simultaneously from any different era.
Yeah.
So I think for young people, they don't actually know when did this appear and what musical movement was it part of, what was the fashion movement that was happening then, what were the social and cultural issues of the time. It's just kind of this amorphous, blob of streamable sound.
Yeah.
Whereas growing up when physical music was the main thing, you didn't have access to countless numbers of records. So what did you grow up listening to? Your parents' records or your siblings' records. And that was true for me and Mike growing up in the 70s. We had a limited amount of music to listen to. And of course we had radio, which
Yeah.
was desperately important.
Yeah.
So we had a very clear sense of lineage. And when I often say this, anyone who arose in the 80s, no matter what you think about the 80s, because it's a very diverse decade, like any decade. We were all children of the 70s. The great writers of the late 60s and 70s taught us how to write. They certainly taught me how to write just by listening to them. Or even the 50s, I would say, the 40s. I was listening to, Rodgers and Hammerstein and Sammy Kahn and Burt Bacharach and Hal David. All these people taught me what I thought was the process of writing. And then, of course, Lennon and McCartney to the nth degree.
Right. Right.
So we really felt that sense of lineage, it would be lovely to include that. It would actually be a sense of freedom for us to just acknowledge that journey to the point where we're at.
Okay. So the songs that are on Wide Awake, I'm assuming that you co-wrote them with Mike. Is that how it works with the two of you?
It doesn't really, actually. Mike produces.
Right.
And back in the original lineup of Johnny Hates Jazz in the 80s, there was a third member as well, Calvin.
Right.
And they were a production team. I've always been a songwriter, singer-songwriter.
I see.
So generally, I'll write the material on my own, and that was true for the hits in the 80s. With this album, actually, we brought on board an old friend of ours called Phil Thornalley. And Phil is well known for writing the Natalie Imbruglia hit Torn, or co-writing it.
Right.
And Phil was Mike's childhood best mate, and I've known Phil since we were both very young. And Phil, bizarrely enough, actually, when I left Johnny Hates Jazz in the late 80s, he replaced me as
Right.
the singer and songwriter. So, but we're old friends. So we just thought it'd be nice to add this other dynamic, because we knew that Phil also was into a certain kind of music from the 70s, and that might be interesting to bring another element to what we were doing. So a lot of the stuff is co-written by me and Phil, not all of it. And
he was with The Cure for a while as well, wasn't he?
He was with The Cure for a while. Yeah, he was the bass player.
Right.
So yeah, Phil, like myself and Mike, we all have our roots in Rack Records and Rack Studios in St John's Wood, London. And these are the legendary studios, still going strong, thank goodness, owned by the incredibly successful record producer of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Mickey Most,
right,
who sadly has passed away now. But we were all children of that world. Mike was an engineer there. Phil was an engineer there. Going back to our original lineup, Calvin was Mickey's son.
Oh, really?
And I was signed to Rack Records as a singer and songwriter. So we all kind of converged on Rack Studios. A lovely little side note to that is that our third hit single, Turn Back the Clock, actually features Kim Wilde on backing vocals. And the only way we pulled that off is that Kim was an artist on Rack Records as well.
Right.
So we keep bumping into her at the studios, working with her in different combinations, and just asked her one day, do you fancy doing this? It was a lovely world to be a part of. I don't think we realized how precious it was at the time, because we thought that kind of existence would carry on forever. We never thought that the traditional way of recording would meet its demise in the way that it has done. So yeah, it's precious time.
Yeah, especially now. I mean, everybody, I'm talking to musicians all over the planet, and everybody's locked down, and they all look like you. They're sitting here in their little room with their keyboards and their computers behind them, and they're working by themselves. And there's certainly, that's a good thing, but like you say, you don't get that collaboration. Kim Wilde isn't walking past you anytime and you go, "Hey, can you sing on this thing?" And I guess
It's a really good point, Marty, because the other thing that did, I remember when I was working on a solo project with Rupert Hine, at Olympic Studios, which now no longer exists. It's a cinema in Barnes in London. Olympic was a very old studio. In fact, my father, who was a successful jazz musician, used to record there in the 50s. And I remember Duran Duran were downstairs, and I think it was Studio 3. I was in Studio 1, the big studio, for a few days. And there was immediately this sense of competition. It was like you saw each other and you said hello. It wasn't very pally.
right, right.
We were all highly competitive with each other, but the fact that they were there, we kind of, everyone was kind of, you know, ears to the ground. What are they doing? You know, who are they working? Grooves are they working? And that was a very, it's an interesting thing, because that sense of competition pushed everyone's level of quality higher and higher. And I often say this with me and Mike. The thing that works between us is that he'll push me as a songwriter to go further, and I'll push him as a producer to go further. And I think that's a good thing.
Right, right. So yeah, so the two of you on and off have worked together since, you know, the mid 80s at least. Has the relationship changed much, or you pretty much know what to expect from each one of you and you kind of go along that path?
Yeah, we know what to expect from one another, but the other thing is that we're both older and slightly wiser. So and I would say both of us are much more tolerant of one another. And in general, Mike and I get on, you know, like a house on fire. We get on really well. But
right.
Of course, any, you know, creative collaboration has its moments, explosive moments. And I think we're just much more able to understand one another and willing to understand one another, which is a wonderful thing about becoming a somewhat older musician. Is in that sense, it's actually more enjoyable.
Right, right, right. So now getting back to the album, to Wide Awake, maybe we can just touch on a couple of the tracks, and you can talk to me about one that kind of stuck out mainly because it had a really nice harmonica throughout. It was Love of the Light. And I'm wondering if you can kind of go a little deeper into that one for me.
Yeah, Love the Light. That was one that we co-wrote with Phil. And I seem to remember that Phil just presented me with a few chords. And groove, a little very subtle, you know, drum machine groove, and I just took it away and wrote this song around it. Love the Light, the melody and the lyrics. And the thing that really got me about it is the chords were quite Stevie Wonder-ish, and Stevie Wonder was one of my heroes growing up. Yeah, I mean, it could be said my main hero, along with the Beatles, of course. And so the chords lent itself to some kind of Stevie-esque approach, and the harmonica came a lot later. It would be an obvious thing to add with Stevie Wonder in mind. But it was also this sense of articulating my pain at different things I was observing in the world around us, how we treat one another, how we treat nature, and saying, but I love the light. I love the idea of a better world. I love kindness. I love optimism. I love empathy. I love compassion. And isn't it time we made that the dominant force on the planet? That's really where Love the Light came from. And I think that in some ways it's the most gentle song on the album. It's not a big rallying cry.
Right.
It's again, it has a sense of melancholy about it, and I think it works well.
And speaking of songwriting, the final track on the record, My Old Piano, is kind of about writing music and making music.
Yeah,
that's something that you've been dying to do for a while.
I mean, ironically, I've got my laptop set up here on my old piano.
Right.
Knocking now, my old Steinway. Yes, it seemed like a really appropriate completion to the song, because we do go around the houses with subject matter on this record, and at the end of the day, it seemed like actually what it comes down to is that when I am struggling in life, when I'm struggling with the various issues that we all face in life, I usually go back to my old piano
Right.
and I find solace there in writing and playing, and the combination of voice and piano for me is primal. It's if you can make a song sound good with those two instruments, and I'm sure guitarists would probably say the same with an acoustic guitar, you've achieved something. You've reached the starting point. My writing process is very traditional. It's got to sound good on voice and piano, or I'm not going to bother. I don't go into the studio and make the production process help a mediocre song sound good. It's got to be a really good song, in my humble opinion.
Right.
Where you get recordings. So yeah, it's a fundamentally important relationship, myself and a piano.
Yeah, because it's interesting. Songwriting, I mean, more contemporary songwriters, a lot of them these days start with the beat and then work from there. And that's very different than, if you grew up listening to Beatles and the Stones and Bob Dylan, you just can't imagine how that works, I guess. But
totally. And in that sense, groove has become dominant. Rhythm has become dominant. Melody is not even called melody, in contemporary rock songwriting teams. It's called top line, which the idea of calling melody top line, to me, I won't do it. Everyone has to change their terminology if they're going to work with me, because I think that's how melody has, to a degree, been reduced. And like you said, when you grew up listening to, Dylan and the Beatles and Stevie and the Moody Blues, and I could name, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, all these great people. They instilled fantastic grooves into their music. You can't find a better groove person than Stevie playing drums on Higher Ground, or Ringo, playing drums all over the place. What a fantastic drummer. So you can have both. And I don't know why we've kind of gone down this extreme realm of kind of over focusing on groove. I think it's probably the whole home studio environment. But it is what it is, and it will find a new balance eventually.
And having said that, there are a few tracks on your album that are kind of funky and groovy. So it's not like you eschew that whole thing. It's just that you more working in, like even the tune before, Don't Stop the Music, is definitely got a little funkiness to it.
Yeah, well, one it's interesting about today's musical world is that there's obviously a myriad of genres and subgenres. So what we used to call music is, now we're apparently synth pop or synth wave or sophistic pop or something like that.
Yeah.
And so one of the subgenres I quite like is future soul, which my kids introduced me to, really, which is really, bands like Hon, who are a London duo. They're really cool, very big in Asia.
Right.
Mama's Gun is another one. They're not big bands. This is fringe music now. But they obviously grew up listening to a lot of the pop soul of the 80s and the 70s, Hall and Oates, that kind of thing. And I'm very touched by that. So, the thing is that R&B has always had a degree of groove as a big part of it. And coming from the 80s as we did, every single track had a Lindrum on it. I mean, and Mike programmed the Lindrams. We embrace that stuff very early on. I've still got my MPC drum machine over there. I love them. But we know their place. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
So Don't Stop the Music. It's that kind of future soul idea. Charlie Puth is actually quite a more well-known example of future soul. He has his moments when he's, I think, actually really good. So we have a bit of that on this album.
Right. So the album is out tomorrow. What happens after that? Because I don't know how things are where you are, but we're locked down at the moment.
Yeah, it's a weird one. The funny thing is that once the album's out, it has a life of its own. We know we can tour. I know there are people who are planning ostensibly for 2021. I think we need to see. We're not planning hard and fast yet. We're going to see what happens. But I think the interesting thing about this time is that if you take away the live element, what are you left with? You're left with the recorded music. You're left with the song. Well, how good is it? This is like the 80s. This is like very much like the 80s, when touring was an offshoot of having a successful record. Recording was off. And so in some ways, I kind of think, well, I think we've made a pretty damn good record. So let's see if we can give it its chance. It's a different world now, of course, without having to fall back on the live world, as we've all needed to do in this, streaming environment, and give it our best shot. It's going to be different. It's going to be different. Thank goodness, so that we can talk about the album with the likes of yourself, Marty, online, because that's a way of reaching the world.
I've been doing it, and I feel bad because, like, I interviewed a band of 23-year-old guys from Seattle, Washington earlier today, and they just come out with their first or second album, and they're just dying to rock out. They're 23 years old. That's what they're made to do, and they can't do it. And they got a record that's just come out. So whereas someone who's been around a little while longer and has kind of gotten that out of their system, and definitely sit back and go, well, there's other things to making music other than.
Precisely. Yeah, I can appreciate their frustration. Must be very, very strange. But we are what we are.
Thank you for talking to me. Thank you for the album. I hope it does everything that you want it to do, and hopefully we'll get to see you here in New Zealand at some time, even if it's just for a short visit. But until then, stay well and keep making the music.
Take care. Have a good night's sleep.
Thank you.